the Vandercook number 5. Here's our number 5, rescued in 2019 from Leader, Saskatchewan, brought to the U of R on the back of a tow truck. We're going to start with our basic lockup. The most simple lockup consists of a form. In this case, we have an old cut. We have some oak lockup strips at the top and bottom. We're using a bit of furniture, just one piece of furniture in fact, and some coins. Any coin will do, but we're using this specific kind of coin simply to make things easier, and we keep this coin and the keys for it with this press. Just like the smaller number 0 Vandercook press, you need a galley tray insert or a galley tray to print type high in this press. So keep that in mind, particularly if you're composing directly on the bed. It's important to lock up the coins on the sides and at the bottom of the form, just enough to hold things in place. Nothing is really moving on this press, at least not the form or the type, so over-tightening will just lead to throwing things out of alignment. If you do have something more complicated to lock up, a lot of type, particularly small type, you may find that it's beneficial to lock it up in a chase first and then affix that chase to the press. Typically, the more complicated the form, the more complicated the lockup. So moving on to registration, that is, how do we ensure that we put our paper in the same place every single time? And particularly, how are we going to line up a first layer with a second layer? Well, this is the registration pins and punch method. This device is a registration punch. You'll find it in the Magnum room, the silkscreen curing room. It's essentially a really expensive and precise 5-hole punch, although we typically only use the center 3, as you can see. I've placed my paper face up, that is good side up, into the punch, ensuring that it goes in straight, using a bit of masking tape on the left side as a guide. And then one sheet at a time, I carefully punch my paper. Now, something to note about this is that registration holes, while interesting, are not aesthetically important or necessary or even desired in the final print. So you're going to need to leave at least 3/4 of an inch to cut off once the addition is done. Here's the last thing I'm doing here. I've got a piece of Mylar that is the exact same size as my paper, and I'm punching it as well. I put a bit of tape along the top because it's easier to see where I've punched my holes, and you'll understand why I've done that in just a moment. So, back on the press. Our press is locked up, and it may look a little different than just a moment ago in the video, and that has to do with the fact that I was filming at different times. But everything is essentially the same. Our form is locked up in the press. And I'm going to go under the press and I'm going to get our registration pins. These registration pins are the same things that we use in silkscreen. They're extremely handy, and they're made to fit the holes specifically from our Stesser punch. So, laying my Mylar face down, assuming that this was a piece of paper, pretending that our good side is now facing our form, I've lined up the Mylar, and the reason why it's Mylar, of course, is that I can see through it, and I can use that to compose where the image is going to fall on my sheet. Now, I haven't written anything on this piece of Mylar other than a small indicator to tell me which side is the good side and which side is the bad side or the back side, but I could use a marker and mark out very carefully where I want different elements of my proposed piece to go. I'm keeping this very simple. Again, clear Mylar, lined up by eye, and then I place my pins onto the wood and tape them down with a bit of masking tape. And now you can see that every time I lay that piece of Mylar down or the piece of paper down, it'll go in the exact same spot. Now, those 3 holes look like they're similarly spaced, but in fact they're slightly different spaces between them, which is why it's important to note which side is the good side and which side is the bad side, or the back side of our paper. So moving right on to inking, I've got a little special surprise here for this particular demo, and that is that we're using a sucker blend, or a rainbow roll, or a dégradé. I've got 3 colors of ink there, and you may see me inking it up in here in just a moment. But I've inked up my form carefully, and for the first one, quite lightly. I placed my paper onto the pins, I put some packing and tympan, and we're ready to print. I'll back up so you can get a better look here in just a moment. But this is an interesting press, different than the small one, in that in one direction you get pressure, and in the other direction the press actually lifts up and moves out of the way. You'll see in just a moment here. But here's our first impression, and it doesn't look too bad. There's our degradé going from red to purple to blue, but it's still pretty light. Now I'm pushing the press roller back to the left side of the press where we started, and in fact, it will not print. The rollers actually lift up just enough to avoid the form. So we're going to ink again. This time I'm being very careful when I ink this particular form because there's a lot of open space, and if I'm not careful, I'll end up inking some of that wood. Not a big deal. I'll just clean it up before I actually lay my paper in place. So our form is inked, and here's a wider shot. I'm placing my paper onto the pins. Next will come my packing, and then my tympan, and then you'll see how the press itself is operated. One hand or two on that handle and pull it all the way across. You'll feel a little resistance. If it stops or if you hear a crunching noise, you've got to stop because something is wrong. But that went across smoothly, and let's see what our second impression looks like. Much better. And now I will roll the press back to the left-hand side. So the really cool thing about this press is that as I roll it back to the left-hand side, it trips a cam which drops the roller back down into pressure mode. So when I pull the press across to print, the roller hits the form and prints. On the opposite end, you might have seen that little motion on the right-hand side there, and what's happening is it's lifting the impression roller so that when I pull the press carriage back to the left, it's just high enough to not print. Very clever. So I've finished printing all of my pieces of paper, and I have one last thing to do here, assuming that I want to print another layer or many more layers, and that is to take my initial piece of Mylar, treat it just like a piece of paper, and print it. So I had some packing and a tympan. Here's where those pins come in handy again, of course. And here's our nice crisp impression on Mylar. Here's an overhead shot, just so you can see one of the ways in which this press may be locked up. Now I'm all done printing this layer anyways, and I have to take those registration pins and move them out of the way. I could print again now, or I could print again later, but either way, like everything in printmaking, there's a little cleaning to do. So here's a different way to set up your registration. This is the T&Bar plus Mylar method, and if you've done lithography before, this will seem somewhat familiar. So you could do them all at the same time as you might do in litho, or you could do them one at a time, and for the purposes of this video, and precision frankly, we're going to do them one at a time. So I've got my paper face down on a nice clean surface, and I'm marking with a very sharp pencil on the back. I place my lines at the halfway point of the paper, and on one of the sides, and only one, I turn my little line into a lowercase t. That's the T end of the paper, and you only have a T on the left-hand side. The right-hand side is a simple line we call a bar. So I'll repeat this on all of my sheets of paper, and then on my piece of Mylar. And just like the registration pins method, I've marked which side is my hypothetical front side and back side of the Mylar. It's important that you use a thin Sharpie or some other thin marker, and you be as precise as you possibly can. So we're back on the press here, and in fact, nothing much has changed since the registration pins method we demonstrated a moment ago. Once again, we're going to use the Mylar, which is the exact same size and shape as our printing paper, and we're going to lay it down over top of our form, deciding where we want it to go. It's important to note that for this particular part of the demonstration, the placement of this image on my Mylar and on my paper is not going to be the same as the first part of this video. This is totally separate, so I hope I'm not confusing you too much here. But effectively what I've done is I've decided on my composition and then placed some masking tape onto the wood, both at the top and the bottom of my form, and then traced a capital T on the left side, and I've simply extended the bar on the right. So here's a close-up of the T, and the top of my paper, in this case the top of the Mylar, lines up with the top of the capital T, and the bar is simply to ensure that my left to right, or top to bottom, depending on your orientation, will line up in the same place every time. So we're going to take an impression on the Mylar, just like we did for the registration pins method. We're just doing this one at the beginning of the printing session, but you could wait till the end. With the usual packing and timpin, carefully pulling the carriage across, and we should get a nice clean impression on Mylar. It's important to note that the ink doesn't dry on the Mylar nearly as quickly as on the paper, so if you plan to use it immediately, you're going to need to be careful. So here is our paper, one of our sheets of paper with T and bar on it, and we'll get in really close to see where that T lines up, and then we'll pull the paper across taut to line up with the bar. If you lay the paper down in the wrong position, it's going to smudge. There's no doubt about it. So you want to be as slow and precise as you need to be. And then, once it's in place, packing and timpin, and roll the press across. Repeat until you're done your addition. Now on to the fun part. Registering subsequent layers. Here's the registration pins method. So we've locked up a very simple form again. In this case, it's just an old cut. So here is why our Mylar comes in so handy. We can very carefully and precisely decide on the composition of this piece. That is, decide where the second layer is going to go. And once we've got it in place, just like we did for the first layer, we put our registration pins into position. And we've got one last chance to look and see if everything is where we want it to be. And if it's not, we can always change the position of those registration pins. But we're happy with the composition, so now we're going to roll up some fresh ink. In this case, it's a simple layer of black. And carefully, lightly roll it across the form. We're going to do a test print here. So we've got paper, we've got packing, we've got timpin, and a quick impression. And we ink again. Now I noticed on that first impression that we have a little tiny bit of ink that seems to be getting down below the height of the form, and so we'll wipe that off before we print. So here's a good sheet of paper with our registration pins, and very carefully holding the paper up over the form so that it doesn't touch and smudge, we place the pins through the holes in the paper, gently lower our paper, packing, timpin, and pull the press across. And that looks pretty good, and it's exactly where we wanted it. And it'll go in exactly the same place on all of the rest of our sheets of paper. So I would guess that you have a pretty good idea of how the T and bar registration is going to go for subsequent layers. Let's have a look. Same thing. We place our Mylar into position, deciding on our composition, and then with some bits of masking tape at the top and bottom of the form, we place a capital T on the left, and we simply extend the bar on the right. We're going to move our Mylar out of the way and ink up our form. The important thing to note about the T and bar is that while capable of very fine and precise registration, it doesn't physically hold the paper in place the way the registration pins do, so you have to be very precise when you lay it down. Very careful in placing your packing and your timpin so as to not disturb the position. And once it's in position, rolling it across will be no problem. But again, movement, slurring, and smudges can happen. And that's the one real danger of the T and bar method. So just like last time around, we're going to save our final impression to be printed on Mylar. We're going to place our Mylar down, packing, timpin, and print. If this is a 2-layer print, it's not particularly necessary, but again, if we're going to print a 3rd or 4th or 5th layer, it's important to know where all the elements lie in our composition. So there you have it. Simple, precise, repeatable registration on the Vandercook No. 5 or any proofing press.